No sanctions equals prosperous Venezuela.
On Tuesday, July 12th, the Young Turks hosted a debate on one of their secondary channels. The topic of the debate was, does socialism hurt or help? Representing the side of hurt was Jorge Galacia, a member of the Dissident Project, an education program aimed at teaching high school children the hazards of socialism. Representing the help side was Democratic strategist Max Burns. The problem with so many debates about the merits of socialism, or socialism versus capitalism, is that they almost always go in one of two directions. Either both debaters end up talking past each other because they cannot agree on the definitions of socialism or capitalism, or they never get to a good, meaningful point of disagreement because they're not actually that far apart. The confusion in these instances also ultimately stems from not being able to agree on an actual definition of socialism versus capitalism. While Galacia is definitely not a socialist, he didn't strike me as some hardcore stop signs are tyranny and cap. He just seemed like a sort of normal right-of-center guy. As for Max Burns, take a wild guess what direction he went in.
What we're talking about is not this kind of Venezuelan, Cuban, North Korean totalitarian socialism. It's the same kind of government's practice throughout much of Europe, including a lot of the Scandinavian countries Republicans were looking at for advice on COVID.
So, in other words, Burns isn't actually a socialist. When he says socialism, he's referring to welfare statism. Those are not the same thing. The people who conflate these two things are not the people who actually live in the welfare state countries. Those people seem to understand that their economies are not socialist. Certain online personalities, their audiences, and the politicians they admire are the ones who tend to conflate these two things. So, at least from what I can tell during this debate, the two of them weren't that far apart. And they didn't really come to too many meaningful disagreements, nor did they adjudicate any consequential questions, which means that the debate was pretty much fruitless. That's not me trying to throw shade at anyone involved. This seems to happen in pretty much every debate about socialism. Socialism debates pretty much always devolve into debates over definitions. While it can be incredibly tedious, it seems necessary, as if you can't agree on what something is, you're never going to be able to properly debate the merits of it. The shortcoming, if anything, was in the debate question itself. Feel free to watch it for yourself, maybe you'll disagree. The link to it is in the description box below. What was interesting was what happened later in the Young Turks show. Galacia was originally from Venezuela, so the economics of that country inevitably came up. Having watched the debate, which aired prior to the main show, one of the Young Turks fans wrote in with a critical message.
They write in, you missed the point regarding the debate. One cannot use Venezuela as an example without explaining the horrid conditions that are caused by the brutal US sanctions. No sanctions equals prosperous Venezuela. No, I know that. But remember, I'm the moderator of the debate. I'm not going to sit there and debate the person, otherwise it's an unfair debate.
The economic effects of sanctions, in specific cases like this, or just generally, are constantly being debated. Obviously, I could not do justice to that debate in one YouTube video. Before I talk about the sanctions imposed on Venezuela, I just want to say that I would bet my bottom dollar that the person who wrote that comment, and probably even Jank, who agreed with it, probably couldn't tell you the first thing about sanctions per se, or specifically about the sanctions the United States applied. I feel like if you asked them to elaborate, they would give an answer like the one Ken Livingstone gave to Andrew Neil back in 2019.
Is America's imposed sanctions. Those sanctions mean that the oil corporation that Chavez imposed when he nationalised it is losing £11 billion a year. Now that's an appalling impact on their economy.
When were the US oil sanctions imposed?
I can't remember when it started.
Well, I'll tell you when.
All right, good.
They were imposed this week.
No, that was the latest.
No, until then there have been no oil sanctions on Venezuela. Indeed, the United States, until this week, was Venezuela's biggest exporter of oil. The 600,000 barrels of oil a day were exported from Venezuela to America. There have been no oil sanctions.
There have been sanctions on Venezuela, just like there have been on Cuba.
What else were there?
Like there are on Nicaragua, like there are on Iran. And these are illegal under international law.
Tell me what... So the Venezuelan economy has shrunk by 50% in 5 years. What US sanctions caused that?
Well, in the first place, there was the collapse of the oil price. That was damaging.
That's not a sanction.
But American sanctions then did damage. I don't know. I've been retired pensioner.
Ken Livingstone was at one point the mayor of London, one of the most important financial cities in the world. and he didn't know the first thing about the sanctions the United States put on Venezuela. I imagine the same holds true for most people you run into online. Most people don't know much about sanctions, but a certain subculture, which consists mostly of leftists, but by no means exclusively so, just know that every single bad thing that happens in the entire world is ultimately America's fault. The bad thing in this instance happens to be Venezuela's poverty, and these people know that sanctions have something to do with economics, therefore one must be the cause of the other. And when you put it all together, you get ignorant comments like the ones we just heard on the Young Turks. The funny thing about certain sanctions is that they oftentimes functionally have the same effect as protectionist policies. Both are a means to prevent trade across borders. Yet some of the same people who squawk about how awful sanctions are applaud protectionist measures. I'm not sure how they square that circle. Another reason why sanctions are such a popular explanation is because certain people need a saboteur to explain away Venezuela's poverty. When Hugo Chavez took power, he promised to implement socialism of the 21st century. This was to be distinct from the socialist experiments of the 20th century, almost all of which had rightly earned a terrible reputation. So how did this new experiment work out? Well, according to lots of folks on the left, things were going great. After Chavez died in 2013, David Sirota, who would go on to become a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders and a contributor for the Young Turks, wrote an article titled Hugo Chavez's Economic Miracle. In that article he wrote, Chavez became the bugaboo of American politics because his full-throated advocacy for socialism and redistributionism at once represented a fundamental critique of neoliberal economics, and also delivered some indisputably positive results. Indeed, as shown by some of the most significant indicators, Chavez racked up an economic record that a legacy-obsessed American president could only dream of achieving. Sirota was far from the only one. Numerous leftists praised the supposed successes of socialism of the 21st century, while Chavez was still alive. The most famous example was Noam Chomsky, the godfather of the online left, who actually went down there and praised the man to his face. No one can deny that Hugo Chavez was a very skilled politician. He genuinely did enjoy popular support during his presidency. Much like other popular politicians throughout the world, he was also incredibly lucky. Just before Chavez took office, oil prices skyrocketed. Chavez ran on a campaign of increased government spending, akin to Venezuela's policies in the 1970s. And with all the money coming from the boom in oil prices, he was able to deliver. Government spending went from 30% of GDP to 40%. In the 1970s, however, the boom in oil prices ultimately backfired. As William Newman wrote in Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse, inside the collapse of Venezuela.
Beginning in 1978, in the midst of the world-changing oil boom, GDP per capita fell every year through 1985. Real wages, that is, wages adjusted for inflation, peaked in 1978 and fell almost every year thereafter, continuing to decline for more than 2 decades. Economists have a name for what happened in Venezuela. They call it the resource curse. The underlying reason for this cycle is surprisingly simple. The large increase in export income causes the value of the local currency to rise. That means the country's other exports, such as manufactured goods and farm products, become less competitive on the world market. So exports of those goods decrease, depressing those sectors of the economy. At the same time, a strong local currency means that imported goods are cheaper. Each Dutch gulden or Venezuelan bolivar buys more than it used to. So the domestic market is flooded with inexpensive imports that consumers snap up. That again hurts local manufacturers and farmers, since now they're also facing tougher competition in the domestic market. Along with all this, wages in the commodity sector increase, such as oil workers' pay, which can force wages higher in other parts of the economy, manufacturing and farming, that are suddenly struggling. Higher wages mean increased consumer demand, especially for all those cheap imported products. But the economy isn't set up to quickly meet the jump in demand. Bottlenecks form at ports, and distribution networks and shortages set in. That leads to inflation as more money chases fewer products and prices increase.
Chavez was determined not to let this happen to his country again. Subsequently, the government took a larger role in managing the economy under Chavez's regime. These interventions had predictable consequences. As Christian Niemitz wrote in Socialism, the failed idea that never dies, the spending splurge was not entirely without precedent. It was a turbocharged version of what happened in the 1970s. And something similar would probably have happened under any government as well. What made Chavismo different was the copious use of microeconomic interventions. such as price controls and exchange rate controls, which then begat further interventions. When the initial interventions did not produce the desired effect, or when private sector actors did not behave in the way the government wanted them to behave, the government railed against the industry in question and intervened in more heavy-handed ways. This often culminated in revenge nationalizations. For example, in 2009, The Economist reported a rice plant belonging to Cargill, an American company, was seized. 2 plants owned by Empress Polar, Venezuela's largest private conglomerate, were taken over temporarily to enforce production of price-controlled rice. Like other companies, Polar argues that controls force it to sell at a loss. Mr. Chavez rejects this argument and threatened to expropriate all Polar's business. Thus, under the Chavez government, nationalizations were not led by strategic considerations. The government did not have a recognizable theory about which sectors ought to be state-run, and in which sectors private ownership was tolerable. Instead, nationalizations were used as a disciplining tool, a way to punish recalcitrant private sector actors. In this sense, socialism of the 21st century was ad hoc revenge socialism. When the government sets prices at below market rates, companies that produce goods in that controlled industry will have to operate at a loss. This means that they're very unlikely to produce said good, and that there will be shortages. And this is exactly what happened. As The Guardian reported in 2007, welcome to Venezuela, a booming economy with a difference. Food shortages are plaguing the country at the same time that oil revenues are driving a spending splurge on imported luxury goods, prompting criticism of President Hugo Chavez's socialist policies. Milk has all but vanished from shops. Distraught mothers ask how they are supposed to feed their infants. Many cafes and restaurants only serve black coffee. Families say eggs and sugar are also a memory. When supplies do arrive, long queues form instantly. Purchases are rationed and hands are stamped to prevent cheating. The sight of a milk truck reportedly prompted a near riot last week. Up to a quarter of staple food supplies have been disrupted. The economic interventions from the state continued, and things only got worse. As The Guardian reported in 2013, certain items long gone from the shelves are hitting a particular nerve with Venezuelans. Toilet paper, rice, coffee, and corn flour, used to make arepas, Venezuela's national dish, have become emblematic of more than just an economic crisis. For Osburdal Olivares, an economist at Econoanalista, apologies for the mispronunciation, one of the country's leading consulting firms, this recent bout of food shortages is the result of a series of elements coming to a head, from an over-reliance on imports to price controls and, quite simply, a lack of funds. Food shortages in Venezuela have not only peaked, but they have lasted longer than ever. For Oliveros, an additional cause for the shortage of basic food staples is the decrease in agricultural production resulting from seized companies and land expropriations. More than 3 million hectares were expropriated during 2004 to 2010. That and overvalued exchange rate destroyed agriculture. It's cheaper to import than it is to produce. That's a perverse model that kills off any productivity. At this time, Venezuela's own central bank put the country's economy at 20% on their scarcity index. For reference, 20% is typical of a country that is being torn apart by war. Again, this was in 2013, well before any sanctions were placed on Venezuela. Not exactly prosperous if you ask me, but the worst was yet to come. In late 2014, the price of oil collapsed, draining Venezuela of its largest source of income. The government substituted this lost revenue by borrowing and printing money, which only served to exacerbate the country's inflation and shortages. Given all this, it makes sense why William Newman's book on Venezuela is titled "Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse." The first round of sanctions the United States imposed on Venezuela was on August 25, 2017. These sanctions cut the Maduro regime off from borrowing money in U.S. financial markets. The thing is, it was already effectively impossible for the Maduro regime to borrow any money. Lending money to Venezuela was already so risky because the country was such an economic basket case that no one was willing to do it. As the Brookings Institute reported in a 2019 policy brief, the Venezuelan sovereign spread, the premium that bondholders demanded the country pay over the so-called risk-free rate, in the 30 trading days prior to August 25th, averaged 2,884 basis points, 7.8 times the spread paid by the rest of Latin America, and 9.5 times that paid by emerging markets over the same period. Interestingly, the imposition of sanctions was not followed by an increase in the Venezuelan spread, which suggests that the announcement was already priced in, or else deemed irrelevant. Venezuelan debt was considered a significantly riskier purchase than its peers by financial markets. The Maduro regime was already effectively shut out from borrowing. So, as we can see, most of the economic calamities existed well before the United States placed sanctions on Venezuela. I was going to talk about the sanctions placed on Venezuelan oil, but this video is already long enough, so I think I'll make another video specifically dedicated to that. Needless to say, I believe that the same thing holds true for that rounds of sanctions. At best, they made already terrible conditions worse. The claim that were it not for these sanctions, Venezuela would be prosperous is completely erroneous. The reason so many online leftists deny this is because so many of them were heavily invested in the success of the Venezuelan economy when things were looking good. There must be a reason other than the inherent flaws in their preferred economic system, that the country is now in such dire straits. And yes, this is their preferred economic system. As of late, many online leftists have raised against corporate price gouging for causing inflation, and applauded the idea of putting price controls on things like gasoline, and have even called for the nationalization of certain industries. But again, please tell me more about how Venezuela is a straw man.